You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, where we discuss all things technical related to the vertebrate pest field. Well, really glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. As those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast know that I tend to publish about once a week, and there's a lot of material. On my YouTube page, I have recategorized a number of videos, so there'll be more within the channel of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast, and so you can also get me over on the competing website, Rumble. So either way, we'd be glad to have you on board. Would like to take a few moments to have you subscribe to the channel, to ring the bell so you can be kept up to date on future podcasts. Also, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Particularly interested in ideas for shows that would be meaningful for you. Give me some things to research. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk about what I'm interested in, what I come across. Just a reminder, this is a technical podcast, so we try to delve into things that aren't necessarily covered adequately by others. If you're, we do cover, trapping per se, but it's not going to be a podcast that delves into, here's, do you put the foothold 3 inches away from the dirt hole set or 4 inches away from the dirt hole set? Unless there's literature and real scientific evidence for that, that's something we'll not good. We'd be happy to interview someone who is a specialist in that particular area, but it's not typically something we would get involved in. There are others who are far more qualified than I am to talk about it, and of course we would love to have them on the show to discuss the nuances of foothold trapping or any form of trapping per se. You can also, one thing I would like to add, and that is, do visit my website here. We do have a online training for those of you that are interested, how to bait cage and box traps like a professional. This is a technical document, or training I should say. It's about an hour long series of videos. It talks about the theory of luring and attracting animals into cage traps, and so it tends to take a more wants you to refocus your attention on what are we doing, what are we attempting to do, in the theory behind luring into cage traps. Because sometimes people just simply get a wad of bait and throw it in the back of the cage, and does it work? Yeah, it certainly works. But is that what a professional should be doing? We should always be thinking about knowing, why are we doing something? What are the reasons why we're not doing something one day? Just because something works doesn't necessarily mean that is the best way to go. It may be adequate, but there may be some underlying principles. And this is the difference between just being an ordinary individual just trying to catch an animal in their backyard, and those of you that are making your living off of catching animals in people's backyards. All right, enough of all that. What are we talking about today? Well, I kind of just got the feeling I should do sort of a dive into histoplasmosis, and I was doing some work for a client, and I thought, I really need to get a better grasp of histoplasmosis, because I just didn't know enough about it, right? And so chances are you're in the same situation that I'm in, so let me pull up my PowerPoint here, and I'll be frank with you, histoplasmosis is a fungal infection, And it is one of the most complicated infectious diseases that we have to be concerned about in the wildlife control space. And those of you that are involved in pest control, as I sort of affectionately call the bug killers, you out there, you're not immune to this either. This is a threat to you because you may be working in areas that are contaminated, of course, with bird and bat droppings. And even if you don't think there are bird and bat droppings there, don't think you're necessarily not going to get exposed to it. So, and I'll tell you, as I'm reading the literature about it, it is complicated. So, if you feel like I'm hedging information, there's reasons for that. As you know, I'm not a doctor. This isn't about self-diagnosis. If that's what you're hoping for this for, this is not what we're about here. We're trying to give you things to think about that you can better understand the disease so you can inform your doctor perhaps of symptoms that you may have. It's very possible that someone like myself that I'm already infected. Right? So a lot of people, only less than 1% of the people who were infected with histoplasmosis exhibit symptoms. So there you go, right? And so it's very possible that I'm infected. And yeah, is that a concern? You better believe it's a concern. So I don't want to create hysteria. I don't want to create hype, but I do want to emphasize the importance for those of you in the wildlife control space that you take your health seriously and you protect yourself, because all it can take is one breath, one inhalation, and you can get a big enough dose of histospores to cause an infection that can really change, that could substantially change your life. If not over the long term, certainly for the short term. All right, now that I think I probably got your attention, if not scared you to death, why don't we get started on this particular infection? All right, so what is histoplasmosis? It is an infection that's caused by the inhalation of fungal spores. Are there potentially other ways to contract the disease? I suspect there are, but we're not going to get too far into the weeds and that side of things until I, find some more evidence for that. But typically, people that get infected with this fungus inhale the spores, and it causes growth in the lungs. So what happens is you inhale the spores go deep down into your alveoli. Those are the little sacs in your lungs that exchange air with your blood. The blood releases carbon dioxide and absorbs the oxygen, and then you exhale the carbon dioxide. Well, those little alveoli there, those spores deposit, and if they can find a suitable location, they begin to convert into growing yeast. And that's what causes this infection. So you end up having literally yeast growing in your lungs. Okay, and that's what histoplasmosis ultimately is. And for many people, it's a limited exposure. Our immune system kind of keeps it at bay, forces it to sort of encapsulate. But for a small portion of the population, particularly those individuals who have immune-compromised individuals, so like HIV, I would suspect people under cancer treatments. But there's a lot of immune-suppressing medications now for people with severe forms of arthritis. So I think they would be more at risk as well. Sometimes when we have a weakened immune system, it can move into not just simply being in our lungs, but disseminated. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what is the incubation period? Well, it can be anywhere from 5 to 18 days. One research article said 3 weeks, which of course about 18 days. Of course, the average before the symptoms emerge is about 10 days. So this is why it's important for you as professionals to keep records, are you working in a particular area? Because if you start getting that cough, right, is it COVID? Is it the flu? Is it histoplasmosis? Well, what were you doing 10 days ago, right? And so this is something you want to be thinking about. Were you exposed? Because people's memories get kind of convenient over time. So what are the common signs of exposure? Well, kind of vague, right? I mean, a lot of zoonotic diseases, those are infections that we contract from wildlife, and histoplasmosis constitutes one of those. Fever, weakness, chest pain, of course, food You get chest pain if you're coughing a lot, of course. Shortness of breath. Well, if you have a pneumonia, then guess what? You're going to be short of breath typically. So this is one of the challenges. But one of the signs, of course, is it tends to be a dry cough. But if you get into longer term histoplasmosis, what we call chronic histoplasmosis, then you can have a productive cough at that point. And then you start getting into things like the sweats, typically night sweats. You start getting weight loss, fatigue, and what's called fibrotic apical lung infiltrates. And you can see these sort of blotchy areas in the lungs. Remember, this x-rays are negatives in the sense that you want more to be dark, right? If you start seeing white, that means something's there, right? And you don't want to be having that. Those lungs should be black, right? Other than what the ribs are showing, right? The ribs are obviously something, but you want to have an empty space, right, for the x-ray. And when you start seeing these infiltrates, right, in those little white spots where you can see my cursor there, that tells you, yeah, you're dealing with something's going on there. And that's one of the signs of histoplasmosis. Another interesting factoid for yourself, and that is to recognize that on average, people experience a 40-day delay before they get diagnosed. So this is one of the challenges when we're dealing with it. And I don't want to throw the doctors under the bus here because it's a tough job being a doctor. The issue ultimately, though, is it's so hard also to diagnose histoplasmosis. And so because look at how vague the symptoms are, right? Productive cough, sweats, weight loss, chest pain, fever. Well, you have the flu, you got pneumonia, right? And so it's very common for them to not think about histoplasmosis, okay? And so people often don't get diagnosed. It's also hard to definitively diagnose this because the testing mechanisms haven't been fully worked out, right? And so this is something that's a challenge. I'll probably do more on the testing side down the road here as I begin to understand more about it. But it's not something that that's easy. It's not like a strep throat test where they could just do a swab and do a quick test and see if you have strep throat. That's one of the challenges with histoplasmosis here. Now, when we get to the clinical signs, they vary. Of course, for many people, they contract the disease, their immune system knocks it down, and they just think they got pneumonia or had the flu or whatever. When it becomes disseminated, that's when the infection leaves the lungs out into other organs. You start getting other symptoms and signs. Red tender bumps on the skin called erythema nodosum. Pericarditis, that's sort of inflammation around the heart. Mediastinal lymphadenitis, and so basically it's just inflammation of the lymph nodes along the mediastinal area, which I'm not exactly sure where that is. Granulomas, and these are sort of little pockets of things inside of your lungs, as you can sort of see in this picture here to your right. Notice you're seeing those red blotches. Those are pulmonary nodules. And so one of the problems with histoplasmosis is that when a doctor sees that, he's thinking cancer, right? And so you end up getting testing done, and it turns out that it's not cancer, that you got histoplasmosis, right? So it can really cause a tremendous amount of fear. And I'm not trying to downplay the significance of histoplasmosis infection. That's not my point. My point is that it causes sometimes you to go through additional tests. Getting a lung biopsy is not fun, okay? It's not something you want to have. Or if they have to cut you open and check something out, that's not a good time, right? And so this is one of the challenges, of course, with histoplasmosis. And then there's also the issue of that it possibly can spread to the eyes. And one article I read said there's a little bit of a debate about that. So I'll see if I can come up with more information about that. So what are some of the organs that disseminated histoplasmosis can occur in? Well, remember, it starts in the lungs, and then if you have, maybe you're immune compromised, that's the majority of people. majority of people who are immune compromised can run the risk of getting that fungal infection to disperse into other parts of the body. For many people who are not immune compromised, the infection would stay in the lungs, right? But for others, it can go out to the eyes, possibly, certainly the brain, to the liver, and for a very, very small portion of the population, some people will die from it. Okay. Typically speaking, people that have really suffered terribly from histo, it seems to be associated with HIV, of course, which is an immune compromising infection. But I suspect other people can suffer as well from it. But don't think just because you're not immune compromised, that you can't get disseminated histoplasmosis. You can. It does happen to people who are not immune compromised. So one of the challenges, of course, for doctors is how are they going to tell that you have histo, right? Because histoplasmosis infection can result in pneumonia, right? So having histo can cause, maybe call it a secondary infection, right? So you get pneumonia. Now, so what are the key distinctions? How would you differentiate that? Well, night sweats. Typically, pneumonia doesn't cause night sweats. Or lymphadenopathy. That's where your lymph nodes, you're not working well. Pulmonary nodules. But how are you going to know you have pulmonary nodules? Well, you have to have an x-ray for that, right? And then, of course, nodules are associated with asymptomatic infection. So this is what causes people to get additional tests, because the doctor, when he sees the x-ray, thinks you have cancer, right? As I already mentioned before. And of course, we don't want you self-diagnosing, right? So this isn't about self-diagnosing. What I want you to do is to understand the nature of this infection, so that when you are working in bird droppings, bat droppings, or in areas that may be nitrogen-enriched soils, and then, a couple of weeks later, you're not feeling very well, and you go to the doctor, you're going to let the doctor know, hey, doc, don't just think I've got COVID or pneumonia that's going around or the flu. I want you to be thinking about that I may have histo as well, right? Don't just simply jump. So maybe rather than having that, lung biopsy that may think you have cancer, that maybe he could do another test that may be a little less invasive to kind of rule out histo, right? So this is a conversation you want to have with your doctor, because your doctor's not thinking about histoplasmosis. So this is, in a sense, an underdiagnosed disease, because more people are infected than what we would ordinarily know, because only 10 states have it as a mandated reporting of the infection. So we don't know what the real data is on how many people are infected with it, right? So it's complicated. And if it sounds complicated, it's not because we're trying to make it complicated. It's because it is complicated, right? So this is where, I want to just use a quote that I learned, and that is, a simple lie is easier to believe than a complex truth. And I want you to avoid the simple lie, right? I want you to understand how complicated it is, and you need to self-advocate for your health and to help your doctor, not let your doctor get blindsided because your doctor is busy, right? Help your doctor understand what you're exposed to, because he doesn't understand it. He doesn't know. He thinks you're going to be working in a desk. He doesn't get that you're exposed to various things. So you need to let your doctor know you're exposed to animals and zoonotic diseases. And that can cause the doctor to pause for a moment and think about his one class of infectious diseases, right? And so help your doctor out, right? And help yourself out. All right, so let's understand a little bit more about Histoplasma capsulatum. Again, it's a fungal, it's a fungus, right? So it's actually called a not a bifurcated, it's a, I forgot the technical name for it, but it actually has two different forms. So it lives in high nitrogen soils, in human environments. Okay, so areas that have high nitrogen, where would that be? Well, it could be fertilizer. Oh, but it also can be areas below bird roosts, soils, and typically the rule of thumb is 3 years. So if you have soil that's been exposed to birds for 3 years, or bats, then you're probably thinking it could have histoplasmosis, right? The fungus comes in two forms. The microconidia, those are the little round dots, small ones here. Those are 2 to 4 microns in diameter. The microconidia, those are the ones that look like a larger double-walled circle with little arms sticking out of them, like a star. Those are going to be, I think, 10 to 24 microns, right? So they're significantly larger. Now, why is it important to you to know the sizes of those those conidia? You need to know that because what do our HEPA filters filter down to? 0.3 microns, right? So that's why we know that the HEPA filters will filter out these spores, provided that your respirator is properly sealed, right? This is why fit testing is so important for you folks, right? The only time you don't have to worry about that is if you're using a positive pressure. And I don't know, I don't think I've met anyone who is using a positive pressure face mask. Positive pressure is where you are not inhaling the air, you're like you're not pulling the air in, the air is being blown into your face. That, in those situations, you don't need to have a tight seal because the air, you're getting a positive pressure, so any air that's escaping is pushing all bad stuff away from your face. But most of us aren't using positive pressure, we're using negative pressure. So as we're pulling air in through the filter, so if we have a bad seal around our face, we're pulling in contaminated air and we run the risk of exposure that way. So make sure you have good seals on your filters. Now, here's the other issue I want to sort of raise for you in the last few minutes that I have with you today, and that is, historically, people have focused on the Ohio River Valley as the place with the highest concentration of histoplasmosis. And so one of the things that the literature has been mentioning, and that is doctors keep thinking that histoplasmosis is not in other parts of the country. And that isn't true. So in other words, they're not looking for it because they're like, well, I'm in California or I'm in Oregon, and that's a disease of people who live in the Ohio area, right? That needs to be dispelled, right? So this is what people thought because of some research that was done in the 1955 area, right? This is from skin testing. They had skin tests and they would say, were you exposed? Were you not exposed, right? Like the tuberculin test to find out were you exposed to tuberculosis or were you not exposed to tuberculosis? Well, they did this test and they found that, hey, a lot of people around this Ohio River Valley were testing positive, so they must have been exposed, right? Well, that's all well and good, but the reality is that when we look at actual infections around the country, you find that 94% of the states have infections. Now, you may say, well, but people travel. Maybe they went to the Ohio Valley. And that's certainly true, right? But what they're finding is when they try to compensate for traveling exposures, they're finding that that travel doesn't account for all of the exposures. So therefore, where are people contracting this disease? Then the next option is, well, maybe where they're living, right? That's the problem. So you can see there's a lot, and when you see this map, you see it heavily concentrated on the eastern half of the United States. But when you look west, you find, in the drier areas, in the more elevated areas of the West, you can still have histoplasmosis as well, infections, and not all of them can be accounted for by people traveling to the East. So something to think about. So now the researchers are saying we need to be thinking about broadening our understanding of where histoplasmosis occurs in being in this particular range. And I have another document that says basically the entire country should be considered an area of histoplasmosis. Certainly the risk is greater in the East, but the West is not immune from it. In fact, they have positive cases from the West that cannot be accounted for by travel. It had to have been derived from locally. That's the only other logical alternative, right? And this is one of the challenges, because when scientists try to talk about this, they're looking for the smoking gun evidence, right? And the problem is it's very hard to find that smoking gun evidence. So they have to make inferences, and so they tend to be tentative, and they're like, well, we don't think it's from traveling, but people's memories, you have to rely on people's memories, right? And so that's always an iffy thing when you're dealing with evidence of this nature. In fact, one article mentioned less than 30% of all the acute exposures to histoplasmosis were associated with bird or bat droppings. Now, how are we to interpret that? Is that people are getting exposed by other means? Possible. Or is it that people just forget that they don't know? We'll have to talk more about that particular problem in the future. So, hope I've given you a lot to think about when we're dealing with histoplasmosis here. But it is a complicated disease. It's a dangerous disease. And the more we understand about it, the more we can be ensured that we protect ourselves, we protect our loved ones, and we protect our clients from this dangerous disease, and making sure that we are responsible for our own health and the health of others as we're performing the important work of doing wildlife control. All right. Well, not the most uplifting and positive, but certainly something I hope helps you on your path of protecting your health and life. You've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast, where we deal with all things technical related to wildlife damage management. Please take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. You can certainly ring the bell to make sure you're updated on future podcasts. I tend to publish once a week. If you have questions, comments, yes, even criticisms, I'd love to hear from you. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. If you're looking for training, materials, consultation, perhaps someone to help you work with your PowerPoints and develop those for training that maybe you need to do, definitely reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. I also do ghostwriting and other research things as well related to the wildlife control space. Well, thank you for your attention today, and until next time, I hope you all take care. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.